Hey, Dustin Vanoy here. I had this need recently to get a sample database up in Azure SQL. And as I was looking for data, Stack Overflow is one that I've used a little bit and I think I can build a big demo project on. And so to get Stack Overflow data, thankfully Brent Ozar has a post with some different varieties of databases you can get, as well as links to getting the actual like file-based extracts. And so I took the smallest one he has, the 2010 Stack Overflow database, and I want to get it up into Azure SQL. And so when you get the files from his site, you'll end up with an MDF file and an LDF file, which is the data file and the log file to attach to SQL Server. In order to get it to Azure SQL, there's a few ways to do it, but all of the ones I was seeing were requiring you to have it actually running as a database somewhere in order to create the right files to get to Azure SQL. So I'm going to show you a pretty easy way to get this to Azure SQL at the end here. But first we have to get something running locally. And so that's what most of this video is about. It is, how do I get SQL Server running on my laptop? You can get SQL Server Developer Edition and install it directly on a Windows laptop. Actually, the install wasn't working for me, is part of the reason I went this path. But the path that I like best is to run it in a Docker container. So I can turn it off and on really easily without really having any extra services trying to run on my machine. And so to run on Docker, this is the first time I've really gone all the way through with SQL Server on Docker. So the directions I followed really weren't bad. They were pretty helpful, but I wanted to take kind of my exact commands, show them to you here in a video because I didn't see a video on it when I was searching. And hopefully it just helps you get SQL Server running on Docker. And then if you only want to see how do I take a locally running SQL Server instance and send a database up to Azure SQL, skip all the way to the end there. In the last minute or two here, I'll show you how to do that. So you will need to have Docker Desktop installed. If you are working individually on your machine, you're not working for your company, then it's free to use Docker Desktop despite the new licensing. If you're working for a small business, it's probably free as well, but you should definitely look at that. If you're doing this just for your own learning purposes, it should be free as well, but I'll let you read the licensing and make sure. There's other ways to run Docker, of course, but Docker Desktop's really helpful if you're running on Windows like I am today. So the first thing we'll need to do where somewhere the Docker is running is go ahead and get the Docker image from the Microsoft repository. There's a variety of ways you can do this, but I'm going to show you using a Windows subsystem for Linux. So using Ubuntu on my Windows machine. And so I can just use bash commands here. The command should be pretty similar if you're actually running on Ubuntu or any form of Linux, and very similar if you're running on Mac as well. I haven't tried it out on all the different environments, but it should be pretty similar. And if I find any differences on Mac, I'll try and put those in the blog post that I'll do to go along with this. Okay, so here we go. So here's our command to pull down that image. It's sudo to give me the super user permissions, and then it's a Docker pull, and then the path. I'm using the latest 2019. You can go find specific versions of that if you prefer. If you're doing sudo, you probably need to use a password. So let me get my super secret password in there. And that one actually is super secret. Okay, so here we go. I've already got the image, so that was really quick. Yours might run through and take some time, but it should print to the screen a bit about what it's doing along the way. I think only a few minutes is probably what I would expect with a decently fast network connection here. So next we need to actually run this container. And there's a little bit involved here. So let's look through it step by step. The first step is, first piece of this command is to do the Docker run, and then -e is to pass in a parameter, and there's a parameter for the accepting the license agreement. And so we are going to run this in the default mode of Developer Edition. You'll want to take a look at the site where the image comes from with some more information if you need to run it for production, and you just pass in your licensing and just make sure you do things that they say in the documentation if you're doing this beyond development. We need to give it a SA password, a server administrator password for SQL Server. And so I have one set as an environment variable. That's what this dollar curly braces means. You could erase all of the dollar curly braces if you don't like that syntax and type your password in directly. Either way, I just set this command. So either way, the history of my shell does show what this password is, and I'll probably go ahead and change it to where it's not going to get logged in history as well. All right, so that's our password. Next, we need to set up the port mapping. And so the port mapping is Typically, if you're only going to run SQL Server instance, what you're doing is mapping your local port to what the default port is for that service. And so we can just say, hey, 1433 on my machine's going to map to 1433 in this Docker container, which is our default SQL Server port. If you're going to run multiple different instances, I would recommend that you just kind of switch out the ports, have multiple ports you use and map ports differently for different instances of SQL Server if you're doing this for development purposes at least. And that's an easier way than trying to set up any special networking and things. Okay, so we have to give this a name. I'll just name it, I'll name it SQL Kickstart here, which might mean I have to change a few commands because the documentation uses SQL 1, so I've already have one of those running. The name is going to be what shows up in Docker. The host name is something that I can use to reference it from. So we'll call that the same thing. I typically call those the same thing. Now for some fun stuff. The fun thing about this is that we are going to do a -v command to specify a volume. And what I'm doing is I'm putting my source system volume. This is a specific path that is on my machine. And then the colon is to say, map it to this container volume or this, on the Docker container. So when this is running, if I do mnt SQL Server on the Docker container, it's going to reference this path on my local, and any data changes and saves will actually happen on my local storage. That way, if I delete this container and spin up a new version in the future, I could map to that same volume and retain the data that I'm working with. It's also by far the easiest way to get the data file and log file available to my Docker container. We're almost there. Hang with me. The last piece of this statement is to actually tell it which container we're trying to run from. And so we are going to say, go ahead and use the MS SQL Server that we already downloaded and made sure we had available. And then we can hit run. So if you get you probably won't get errors here. I haven't seen a lot of errors here unless you mess up the syntax. If you didn't get that SA password set correctly, you'll find that in the next step when you're trying to log in. So I'll show you how to change that password at the end. Let's go ahead and just use the password I set up to do some things here. So one way to work with this, it may not be your default way, but I think it's a great way to get started. Let's clear some space here, is to run docker exec interactive command on my host, which is, I changed the name to SQL Data Kickstart. You use whatever name you chose for yourself. And then bash is the command I want to run. So what this is going to do is go execute on the container and keep the session going. And it's going to specifically run bash, which is basically my terminal. Apparently, I did not name it what I thought. I named it SQL Kickstart, right? Yeah. Here we go. SQL Kickstart. I'm in my machine, and so I can see my machine name that I gave it. It's telling me that that's my username. The way we're going to do this, at least in my example and the one that I'm following from the docs that I'll leave in the description for you to follow along on your own if you like, is use SQL CMD. So SQL command line is something that you can use from your machine to connect to this. You don't have to be on the container itself, but it's a pretty easy way to test some things out. So we're going to run SQL command line. We're going to connect to localhost because we're on the machine that SQL Server is running on. So we can just call it localhost. And then the user -u is SA. It's the SA user. You could also do -p and fill in your password right here. Instead, I'll go ahead and type it in myself since I'm doing this interactive anyway. Password's entered, and now I'm in SQL CMD and I can run some commands. The way to tell whether or not I've actually made it where I want to be and see what's going on, which will be a whole lot of nothing, it'll be the default SQL Server setup for me, is to run the command I'm about to show you. Select name from sys.databases. So we're basically saying what databases exist. If you used to Postgres, I think it's show databases or something there, or at least MySQL would be show databases. Here's the databases I have. These are default for SQL Server. So that means I haven't done anything special, but I do have SQL Server running, and I do have a password. If you're getting into security and things already, go ahead and create your own users and start to set it up the way you would any SQL Server instance. There's really nothing that I can think of that you need to do too different. But this is just my test environment. And so I'm going to keep using SA user. I created a database here. Now, wouldn't it be nice to make sure that that database exists? And there's a few ways to do that, but one of them is to use that same command I just did. So now you may notice that I have 5 databases, testDB being the last one. Pretty great, huh? So now what we've proven is that I have SQL Server running. There we go. Exit will get you out of there, by the way. I have SQL Server running. I can connect to it with the password that I set, and I can start to do what I really need to do for my example I talked about at the beginning. So notice that I'm still on SQL Kickstart. I'm on the Docker container that's running right now. I'm not on my local environment. And so to get out of there, I can type exit again, and that'll get me back to my command line. So I said I'd show you how to change the password since the quick start recommends you do that. Here's the command. You can copy and paste this. If you chose your own name instead of using SQL 1, then you'll need to make that switch. So when I jump back to the terminal, I'm going to use SQL Kickstart instead of SQL 1 because that's what I named my container. Okay, so we paste in the correct command after we've replaced the host name if needed. And when you hit enter, it's going to prompt you for the old password. So go find that, then the new password. And then we can, if you need, it may prompt you for sudo access and you just put your Linux password in there as well. And then your passwords change and you start using that new password everywhere you access this data as the SA user. And now to test that out, you can just go back and do those same steps where you run bash on the container and then use SQL CMD to connect, or go back and try a brand new connection from Management Studio or Azure Studio to see if this new password's working like it's supposed to. If you want to go a lot further with the Docker image, I'd recommend checking out the actual page that goes with it. It has a lot of information in a very concise space, but the full documentation, the quick start here, and then the full documentation, which I link to in the post that accompanies this, will be a place to go and really dig into details and customize this. And especially if you're going to run in production, provide a license, then you want to make sure you're looking through more of this than just what I've shown you here to get you going. But all in all, I was really happy with the quick start guide. Once I found the right quick start guide, it worked pretty well for me, but I did want to kind of distill that down into a video for those that are new to this. Let me show you how I would do this with Management Studio, which is more likely what I really do when I'm setting this up. You could use Azure Data Studio as well, especially if you're on a Mac. This is what I'm most comfortable with, and I happen to have it installed on this machine. So we will use localhost because it's actually running locally. That container's running on this laptop. And then I need to put in my same SQL administrator password that I did before, and then I can go ahead and connect. Once that's connected, what we're going to do is actually attach a new database. So I'll walk you through that really quickly as well. So to attach a new database, we'll first need to make some files available. So let me show you that before we get into attaching. So from my File Explorer, I'm going to copy the files that I need. Okay. And then go into the folder that I mapped, which was a SQL Server folder. And let me show you real quick. There's nothing in data, nothing in log yet. I could have had this set up in advance, but I wanted to show how I get this stuff set up after the thing's already running. So I'm going to paste those two folders with actual data in them into here. And now when we go in, we'll see an MDF file in data. We'll see a LDF file in log, and I can go and create my database from there. There we go. Log file there. Log file again. Data file there. All right. So now if I come in here and choose attach, I can go ahead and find that file location and set this up there. Okay, so I used an alias just to simplify things. I have a link to that same directory, just that if in case you notice that I'm using a little bit shorter path here. Here's my data file. And then when I come down and look at the logs, I can go ahead and change this to be the log file. So now that I have a database, I can actually click around, view some tables, and query some of this to make sure it's working. It does work. It's fine. Everything's good. Let me show you the next step, which is how do I get this up to Azure SQL? So if I right click, choose task, and then find the deploy database to Microsoft Azure SQL database, that'll take me to the wizard I need. And this is pretty self-explanatory from here, I believe. But basically you can go ahead and just connect to an Azure SQL server. So I would set this up in advance. And then this is one that I've got credentials for. I've saved them here just to make this demo smoother. And I connect with credentials that have enough access. I'm using my actual administrator user for this. And then I can give this a database name. I can actually vary it a little bit. So we'll call this number 2 because I already did this once. And then you can change some of these defaults. Let me see real quick if there's any defaults I want to show you. Database size is the one I'd like to change. So we'll set that to 12. I also want to play around with how I'm setting up these resources in Azure. So I think I'm going to do these settings here. And honestly, once I deploy this, I'm pretty sure this does not deploy as serverless. I go and swap it to serverless after it's already been deployed myself. Something to know that gets into a more advanced topic than I plan to go into right now is that this is going to create a backpack file under the covers. And so basically this backpack file could be created and deployed a variety of ways. I'm going to just do this all interactive through the wizard and let it deploy that up to Azure for me. Okay, so I get an error message, and this message means that my serverless server is not actually available right now. And so I'm going to go make a little connection to my existing database, get that thing up and running, and try again. I think that's going to get us there. Okay, so I have a database I've created before with one little example table. So if I just do a quick select from there, that should get some resources going, and I think that's going to give me better luck. Okay, so I know my server's working. I know I can connect from here. I can use the same password I was just trying to use. This Stack Overflow database, by the way, is from when I tested this before I made the video, because I've learned it's good to test things before you try and show other people. Now we're back to localhost. Back on localhost, same steps as before. Right click, task, deploy database to Microsoft Azure SQL database, okay? Now we'll click on next and we'll set up our settings again. Okay, so it looks like that connection worked correctly this time. Now what's happening is it's going to actually prepare itself, run through some validation, do a variety of things. When I did this before, it took quite a while. So I expect to fast forward here and we'll just see that it actually worked at the end. So here's the final results after it has run through its process, created the schemas and uploaded the data. So that took quite a while. I stopped for a couple hours and came back to this. So depending on how big your container size is, how much resources you give to Docker, things like that, your time's going to vary. This is like an 8 or 9 gig database. So you may want to just start with something smaller if you're just trying to test out how do I deploy from Docker into Azure Cloud. But once that's done, I can go view it in Azure. So let's take a quick look at that. Here I am on the Azure SQL Server that has multiple databases. If I go and look at the list of databases, I see the original one I did, Stack Overflow 2010, and then this brand new one that you saw me do. Notice that I'd gone through and switched one of these to serverless. That's what I'll do with this one as well if I keep it around. But basically what I want to show you is that we can click in on it and we'll find that we could either use this query editor here or connect from Management Studio. We'll see data, we'll see tables, everything's been shifted over, and I no longer need that local instance anymore. The other thing I haven't really dug into, but should be pretty easy to find, is if you want to save the backpack file so that you have the file to recreate this database in the future, that's probably something I'll go check offline and see if I can just stash that away so I don't have to go through this the next time I want to create this database. So there we go. We set up SQL Server on Docker. We were able to run that. I showed you a few things about how to use that and test it out. But ultimately, once we had it running, we just connected with Management Studio and attached a database. In my case, you may not even need to go that far, but we attached a database and went ahead and ran through the steps to get that up into Azure SQL, which is my whole use case for doing this. Hopefully that helps you get started with running this in development mode. Again, consult the documentation for how do I do this in production? How do I do this in different deployment scenarios than what I just showed? And big props to Microsoft team for documentation. That was really useful on this. I think just tracking down the right documentation is what took me the most time. So I figured it'd be worth making a video for anyone else that's trying to figure this out. If you want to know more about what I do with this database next, and subscribe to the channel, turn on those notifications, because the next thing I'm going to do is take this database and copy all of the tables in parallel with a single PySpark notebook from Azure Synapse. I might even show you how to do it from Azure Databricks since it's the same type of code. So coming up next is, now that I have SQL Server as a source, how do I move all this into my data lake pretty efficiently using a single notebook? So stay tuned and I'll see you then.